This video is an introduction to arrays in C++. So a lot of times you may need to store a large quantity of data. And more data than you probably don't want to declare an individual variable for each of those pieces of data. And so one thing that you can do is create an array to store everything. So for example, let's say I want to store the ages of 10 people. You start out by we'll call it an int. You could do a short int, but I'll just make it an int. We'll call it age. But now, instead of just declaring one variable, I'm going to put the square brackets and the number 10. And what I've done right here is created 10 int variables. You know, where each int is 4 bytes, so you've actually used up 40 bytes of memory right here. You've created 10 int variables under the name of age. Now, one thing you can do is you can initialize the values of the variables by putting an equal sign and then the curly braces. And now I'm just going to make up some ages. So let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And let's go to a different age. Okay, so I've just initialized the 10 elements of this array with these ages right here. So now, if you want to output one of the elements within age, you'll need the square brackets and you need to put the index number. That's the number within here. And arrays will start with index number 0. So the first element in an array is index 0. And the last element will be index 9, or 1 less than the size of the array. Okay, so if I do index 2, see out index 2, then let's run it. And you'll see that it outputs the 33 because that's index 0, index 1, and index 2. And, you know, you could work with it. Like you could say things like index 2 plus plus. You could increment that element. So now it will output, you've just added 1 to that element. So now it's 34. You know, you can do assignment statements. Age index 0 is now equal to 15 to reassign the value. Okay, now when you're working with the arrays, often you will be working with for loops also, because a for loop will allow you to step through each one of the elements in an array. So let's create a for loop to print out every one of these elements right here. So I'm going to use I is equal to 0, the first element, while I is less than 10, not less than or equal to, it's less than 10, so it actually goes to 9, and an I++. And then I'm just going to see out age index I, and an indel. And let's run it. And so it will output all 10 elements of this array right here. Okay. There we go. Now, I'll show you something else you can do is, let's say we want to sum up all of these elements also. So to do that, I can use that same for loop. But I'm going to create another variable called sum and initialize it to 0. So it'll basically be a running total. And so we've already got a for loop that's stepping through every element. And so what I can do is I can just add that element to sum. Sum plus equals age index I, semicolon. Okay, so I is going from 0 to 9. And so we add each one of these, age of I, to sum. And now after the for loop, now we could output sum is equal to, and then sum. So let's run it. And so there we go. The sum of all of those elements is equal to 383. Okay, so you could do that's an array of integers, but don't forget about the other variable types. So let's just say, for example, let's do an array of strings, and we could call it months, and we could make it 12, and equal to, I'll just shorten it, Jan, and I'm not even going to finish it, Feb, March. Okay, I'm not going to finish it up. And so now, if I were to say cout months element 3, then that will output April. So now one thing that this is just my personal taste, is since you usually think of 3 as March, I'll go ahead and just make months one element bigger, and then the first element, I'll just kind of make it equal to nothing right there. And so that way, by doing that, you can, now when you print out months of 3, give you that. And that's just personal preference, completely up to you. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to arrays, but now let's take it to the next step, which is two-dimensional arrays. Okay, I've created this program with a two-dimensional array, and let me zoom in a little bit and let's take a look at it. Okay, so I am creating an array of char variables, single characters, and I'm naming it grid, and this is a two-dimensional array. And I'm doing grid because you can think of this as, this is how many elements are in the X direction, and this is how many's in the Y direction. So think of this as a grid that you might use like maybe for a two-dimensional game or something, where you have the X location and the Y location right here. Okay, and so that creates so this is actually creating 20 times 10, or I guess 200 elements of char variables. Now, to populate the array, this is where you're going to have to think a little bit, is we're going to use a nested for loop to populate this array. A for loop inside of a for loop, where the inner for loop is taking, I'm using X as my iterator, my counter variable. I'm going to go from 0 to 19. So that's right here. And then X plus plus. And then my outer for loop, I'm taking Y from 0 to 9 for the Y position. Okay, and so this nested for loop will actually step through all 200 elements of this two-dimensional array right here. And all I'm doing within it is assigning that element to a period. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put some random $signs in the grid. Well, I didn't seed my random number generator, so they're not going to be that random. But so what I'm doing is I'm saying grid random, give me a random integer, mod it by 20, so you'll get a number between 0 and 19. So you get a random number for the X, and then square brackets again, and a random %10, which gives you a random number between 0 and 9. So this will take any random number within those 200 elements and assign it to a $sign. So my entire grid's all periods, but now for the elements, random elements will be equal to $signs. And then I'm going to print the grid. I'm going to print the array. And I'm going to use the same type of nested for loop that I did right here with a couple of modifications. Okay, so nested for loop, where the outer for loop is Y goes from 0 to 9, the inner for loop where X goes from 0 to 19. But then I'm going to cout that element, grid of XY. And I'm also going to put a space after it outputs that element. Then after the inner for loop, which prints one line, it prints all the x's one line across. After it prints that, I'll do an indel, so it'll skip down to the next line. Okay, so now this may have been a lot to take in, but you know, it's a video, you can rewatch it, and I encourage you to do this and experiment, play around with it, see what you can make it do. And so let's build and run it, and so this is what we get. So it's printing out our entire grid, which 20 elements in the X direction, 10 elements in the Y direction right here. And then, of course, it put in 4 random dollar signs in there. Okay, so I'll let you see this program once more. And so we create the 2D array. Yes, you can do a 3D if you want to. Printing it may be a little more difficult. And then we populate the array with periods using a nested for loop. Then we put in some random dollar signs. And then we print the array using a nested for loop. Prints each X direction and does that 10 times. Okay, and this is a quick introduction to arrays, and I hope you have a great day.